In the spring of 1349, a priest walked into the village of Eyam in Derbyshire to conduct Sunday Mass. The church was empty, because in the 12 weeks since the plague had arrived in his village, every single one of his parishioners had died. He was the only person left in Eyam who was still alive and still walking. He wrote about it in a letter that survives to this day. He described the silence as the loudest thing he had ever experienced. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in 4 years, somewhere between 25 and 50 million human beings. The single greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history.
This is not a story about how the Black Death killed the people. This is the story of what came after the dying stopped, of the fields that nobody was left to harvest, the houses that stood empty for years because there was nobody to inherit them, the churches where the priest outlived his entire congregation, and the villages that simply ceased to exist, just emptied, quietly, over a single winter. The silence it left behind was so total, so complete, so incomprehensible to the people who survived it, that it changed everything that came after. The way they thought about death, the way they thought about what a human life was worth, and the way they thought about the people who had power over them, and whether that power deserved to continue.
In June of 1348, a trading vessel arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset on the southern coast of England. It had come from Gascony in France. Several of its crew were already sick. Within days, people in Melcombe were dying. The disease that killed them was not unknown. It had been moving westward across Europe for 2 years, arriving in Sicily in October 1347, moving through Italy, France and Spain with a speed and lethality that contemporaries described in terms that suggest they were witnessing something outside the category of normal human experience. In England, nobody knew it was coming. The disease presented in 2 primary forms. The bubonic form caused swellings, buboes, in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpit and neck, accompanied by fever and the distinctive smell of putrefaction that contemporaries described as the smell of death while the person was still alive. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs directly and was transmitted through breathing. A person with pneumonic plague could infect everyone in a room simply by speaking. The mortality rate for bubonic plague without treatment was approximately 60%. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague was effectively 100%. Nobody in England understood any of this. They had no germ theory, no concept of infection, no understanding of the fleas on rats that carried the bubonic form, or the respiratory transmission of the pneumonic form. They had 4 theories: bad air, divine punishment, astrological conjunction, and the poisoning of wells by Jews, and none of them led to a single effective intervention. From Melcombe, the plague moved inland. The speed at which the Black Death moved through England in 1348 and 1349 is still studied by epidemiologists trying to understand how disease spreads through pre-industrial populations. It followed the roads, it followed the rivers, it followed the trade routes between towns. It moved approximately 2 miles per day on average, slower in winter, faster in summer when the flea populations that carried the bubonic form were most active. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached London. By the spring of 1349, it had reached the north of England, and by the end of 1349, it had covered the entire country. In London, the mortality was so severe that the existing churchyards could not absorb the dead. New burial grounds were opened outside the city walls, mass graves dug in fields that could accommodate hundreds of bodies, filled layer by layer as the death toll accumulated faster than individual burial was possible. Contemporary accounts describe the specific texture of the silence that preceded the worst outbreaks. A town would be functioning normally.
market days, church bells, the sounds of ordinary commerce and daily life. And then, over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, it would simply go quiet. The market would stop because there was nobody to sell and nobody to buy. The church bells would stop because the bell ringer was dead. By 1350, the acute phase of the first outbreak was over. The plague would return in 1361, in 1369, and in 1374, in subsequent waves throughout the following century. But the first outbreak had done its primary work. England had lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population in approximately 2 years. A medieval English village was an integrated system of labour, obligation, and knowledge that had taken generations to build, and that required every component to function. The blacksmith who shod the horses, the miller who ground the grain, the thatcher who maintained the roofs. When 1/3 of the village died, it was rarely distributed evenly across these roles. Sometimes the blacksmith survived and the miller didn't. Sometimes the priest died, and there was nobody qualified to perform the last rites, which, in a society that believed in the literal damnation of souls who died without confession, was an existential terror. The knowledge died with the people. Crop rotation systems that had been refined over generations were abandoned because the people who understood them were gone. Some villages never recovered. The Black Death changed the mathematics overnight. The feudal system had one rule above all others. There were always more peasants than work, always more hungry people than fields to feed them, which meant lords could pay whatever they wanted, demand whatever they wanted, and if a peasant refused, there were 10 others standing behind him who would accept. This was not cruelty, it was mathematics, and it had organised English society for centuries. 1350 was a year that there were more empty fields than people to work them. Lords who had never competed for anything in their lives suddenly found themselves competing for labourers. Peasants who had never had a choice suddenly had one. They could walk to the next village and find better pay, better conditions, better treatment. For the first time in English history, the peasant had leverage. The ruling class panicked. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, a law that attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and legally force workers to accept employment at the old rates. It was one of the most comprehensively ignored laws in English history. So, for 30 years, the peasants who had survived worked harder, earned more, and watched the ruling class try every legal mechanism available to take it back from them. But something had changed that could not be unchanged. The idea that the order of things was fixed, that peasants were peasants and lords were lords and God had arranged it that way and it would never be different, had been tested against a catastrophe that killed them both indiscriminately. Back to the village, back to the silence. It is the autumn of 1349. The first outbreak is subsiding. You are one of the survivors, in a village that had perhaps 200 people at the beginning of the year, and has perhaps 90 now. More than half the people you knew are dead. Your priest may be dead. Your lord may be dead. The people who managed the common fields, who maintained the mill, who kept the records of who owned what, may be dead. The harvest that is still standing in the fields represents the work of the people who died planting it. There are not enough of you left to bring it in before winter. Some of it will rot where it stands. The houses of the dead are empty. Their doors hang open. Their fires have gone out. At night, the village is not dark in the way it used to be dark. The warm orange glow of fires in every window, the sounds of families settling for the evening, the occasional voice. It is dark in a different way. Most of the windows are black. Most of the fires are out. Most of the voices are gone. This is what the Black Death left behind. Absence, the shape of what used to be there, visible only in the negative space where it no longer was. The Black Death killed between 25 and 50 million people in 4 years. By any measure, it is the worst demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. The Second World War killed approximately 70 to 85 million people over 6 years, a larger absolute number, but the medieval world had a fraction of the modern population. As a proportion of the people alive at the time, nothing in recorded history comes close to what happened between 1347 and 1351. And yet, the world that emerged from the silence was not simply a smaller version of the world that had entered it. It was a different world. A world in which the certainties that had organized medieval European society, the permanence of the feudal order, the absolute authority of the church, the fixed relationship between lord and peasant, and the idea that suffering was God's will and therefore resistance was impiety, had all been tested against a catastrophe so total that none of them survived intact. If God had sent the plague as punishment, what had the innocent children done to deserve it? If the church represented divine order on earth, why had so many priests died alongside their congregations? If the feudal system was the natural order of human society, why had it collapsed the moment the labour that sustained it disappeared? The people who survived the Black Death did not ask these questions. They were too busy burying the dead, harvesting what was left, keeping themselves warm through the winter. But the questions were there, in the silence, in the empty houses, in the fields that nobody came to plant in the spring. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the slow, grinding, century-long process by which medieval certainties gave way to early modern questioning, all of it has roots in the silence of 1349. The world could be different, but the silence never fully went away.